So where we left off talking about APIs last week, this is the API that I did in the demo last week. Fairly simplistic, no real SQLized database that's being used here. Basically, two routes. One of the routes which ends up generating a token. Again, that token, you don't want to store any real secret data within that token, but the main purpose for that token is to identify the user and to make sure that that token doesn't end up getting manipulated. There's this idea of a payload and an encrypted version of that payload, and that's done with the secret key. So you always want to make sure that in a production environment, you'd have some environment other than foobar that you'd be setting for that key. But as you recall, you could basically, the first part of this is to go in with the credentials. The credentials end up returning a token. You could end up storing this token on the client side in local storage. So if there's a hard reload in a single page app, you could use that token and attempt to go and log the user in. Assuming that that token comes in the form of a header, and again, we don't really want to muck up our API by putting a placeholder for our token. So instead, when we send it, we end up sending it as a header with a key of authorization. Again, a header is basically just a collection of keys and values. And one of the things that we're going to send if someone wants to hit this endpoint is this authorization token. And we're going to attempt to decode it. If the token wasn't tampered with, this won't end up blowing up, in which case we'll have an ID, and let's operate under the assumption that we're able to go and find the user. So here's an example of an API that we ended up using. Now let's talk a little bit about how we end up using APIs within different environments. So I've got this beautiful slideshow that I ended up creating. And let's talk a little bit about APIs and environments. And again, this could end up getting a lot more complex based upon how many parameters you have set up for environment variables, but we're going to keep ours relatively simple here. Let's take an example. And this is what we ended up looking at the other day. What we could have is that we can have a client application, and you can imagine that this client application could either be a web application, it could also end up being a native application, and this is basically just going to be dealing with the UI. In terms of getting the data, it's going to end up getting the data from somewhere else. Now again, up to this point, we've gotten our data from the same application that we serve up our web application, but this is not always the case. So let's assume that we are using some separate API, so we've got some separate API that's out there, and one of the things that we might end up doing is that we might end up logging in the user, getting an auth token, and then on subsequent requests, we'll end up sending that auth token as a way of identifying who the user is and what resources the user should end up seeing. Well, now let's think about different environments that we might end up having. So let's say that locally we're testing this thing out. And let's say locally that we are setting up an Express application that serves our React application, our index.html page, and all the JavaScript that's there, and it serves it on port 3000. Well, maybe that API that we hit, frankly, that API could live at port 3000, or we could end up setting it up so that that port could be at some other location, maybe port 3001. And if we're just running locally, we might have everything set up locally where our web application is being served from a local port and our API is going to be served from a local port. In a production environment, this is going to be a little bit different. In a production environment, maybe our web application is served from acme-corp.com. And maybe we're hitting an API which is on some other domain. And again, in this case, probably to make sure that no one's sniffing out our tokens, we would end up using SSL. Heroku ends up doing this automatically to make sure that people can end up grabbing these tokens that we were using. So here we've got two different environments, in which case it would be pretty likely that we would have a couple of different APIs that we were using, or different combinations of servers that are serving our web application and servers that are serving our APIs. Now, you could take this a step further. Maybe you have a local environment. Maybe before you end up pushing things to production, you also have a dev environment. Maybe even have a testing environment. Sometimes there's other things that are called staging environments. And each of these might be configured to work with their own APIs. So you go and build things locally. When things are built locally, there's some process that pushes things to some dev environment that's going to be hosted somewhere. This can be hosted to Heroku as well. And again, if people want to test this out, they're not going to be hitting your local API. They're going to end up hitting some dev API that's somewhere else. And you might end up doing the same thing for testing, and you also might have a production environment that serves your React application and a production environment that has your API. Well, you could also mix and match. So nothing would really prevent you from developing your application locally, and maybe in your application settings locally, you go and you end up hitting some development API. Okay? Now, a couple of things that are important here. If you're developing things locally, I think you'd want to be very careful about hitting a production API. If you're just looking at data, probably not that big a deal. But if you were going to go and start adding data and removing data, it would be a little bit of a bigger issue. And odds are you'd probably want to stay away from your production API here. But a development API, not the worst thing in the world to do that. Why would you want to do this? Well, take the example of someone who's going to be working on your application, and all they're doing is writing the React part of the application. So you bring someone in, someone who's an expert on React. Maybe they're just working with the style sheets of the application. Okay? So you could bring someone in locally. They could set up their environment to end up serving a React application, but they don't have to necessarily go through the process of setting up all the server-side code to make sure that Postgres is running, to make sure that SQLize is installed, and all of the other things that might be a little bit more complex in terms of hitting the API. And this would give them the ability also to probably work a little bit easier in other environments, because really they wouldn't have to be all that concerned at all about the back end that they were working with. Okay? So if they're just a developer, you don't have to worry about, hey, look, you got to make sure that Postgres is running. No, let's configure it so you're hitting the development API. And I think that that's kind of a helpful example where these things might end up getting mixed and matched. So one other thing, and this is not really in any detail here, but you could sort of think about if you have these APIs out there, how you might want to protect them. And so one of the things that we do is that we end up using CORS to say, hey, look, yes, you can hit our API with an AJAX request. Because when you end up making a cross-platform AJAX request, before it ends up doing this, it attempts to find out if you're allowed to make a cross-origin request to that API. So one way to protect this is you might control what origins can end up hitting that API. And again, that's going to protect who can end up calling it through an AJAX request. Now, again, that doesn't obviate the need to go and actually look at your API itself and make sure that your API, if you're able to hit it, doesn't end up giving you a list of all the users with all their passwords and giving you all detailed information about users that you don't want to expose. This is logic that you're going to have to put into your API to prevent that from happening. It's not something that I think you have to necessarily worry about now, but it's something that you will have to worry about in a production application. Vince.
This course thing is a module that it's another website that is sort of a
No, what CORS is what happens is that when you attempt to make what the browser will end up doing is that if you attempt to make an AJAX request to a site other than your own, an AJAX request, you can request a script from any site, okay? Putting a script tag on your page, right? You can put a script tag that goes to another domain. No one really cares about it. But when you attempt, the browser has some security. If you attempt to make an AJAX request to another site, before it'll end up making that request, it's going to go and determine whether or not it's allowed to make that request. So it's going to send a special request up with a method type of options. And what's going to happen, CORS will basically send back and say yes. CORS basically handles that request that ends up getting made. You don't make it. Okay? Your browser ends up making it. CORS handles that, and CORS says, okay, here's a request that's coming in with options. And by default, if you end up doing it, and this is what I did last week, where we ended up using this CORS module here, if you recall.
So it's not.
Well, we are using a CORS module, but you could actually write your own if you wanted to. This is basically just a way of handling a certain type of request and sending a response. We don't want to roll our own, so we end up using a CORS module in order to do that. Right, and that's done, I think, right over here, where we just require CORS. And if you actually looked at this middleware, I'm sure what it's doing is that it's looking for a route that has a method type of options, and by default it says, yes, we accept CORS requests, and by default it says, yes, we accept gets, puts, posts, patches, and whatever else. If you wanted to fine-tune it by locking it down, you'd probably put some other information within these parentheses. Okay? So now let's talk about using this API, which we did a little bit of the other day. So here, I'm going to use my generator here. I'm going to take this code here, copy it. This is basically just a big, real single-page React application because everything's actually on one page. And let's go over here, and I'm going to make a directory. And let's make this directory called Acme Web, and we'll cd into it. And let me do a git init. Let me do an npm init. Let me touch index.html. And let me open up Vim. And let's set up a site that's going to use this file. So this is a React application that's not using Webpack. It's getting all its data from all these CDNs. And if I wanted to serve this page, what I could end up doing is doing a npm install of Express. I could save it. And let's go over here and let's set up our server. And so for our server, we'll do const app. Let's actually do const express equals require express. Const app equals express. And we'll say app.get. And just for starters, we'll just go to the main path, request, response, next. And we'll say response, send file, path.join. And this is going to be our directory name, index.html. And let's bring in our path. And we'll go over here and we'll have this listen. So we'll say const port equals process.environment port or 3000. And we'll say app.listen on the port. And we'll just spit out a message, console.log. Listening on port port. So let's go over here and in our package JSON file, let's do a start dev, and we'll say nodemon server. So npm start dev, npm run start dev, and let's go over here and let's open this up. So I actually have this API running locally. You see this is running on port 3003, and I'm going to go over here, and this is going to be localhost 3000, which is going to end up returning this simple page. If I log in, it's going to tell me that I'm logged in as Mo, but this is really just kind of hard-coded. If I go and look at my source code, my React generator goes down here, and I'm actually putting in, I anticipated this, I'm putting in this base URL, but I've got a temp login method, which is going to be a thunk, and I've got this commented out. Instead of actually just setting the user based on the credentials that are passed in here, let me actually log in the user through an API. So I'm going to go up here to the base URL and the tokens. I'm going to end up getting the user back. So we know that our API is expecting to get a auth token. And the way that we end up using an auth token in Axios is by putting in this second parameter. And again, this really reiterates the idea that headers are really just a collection of keys and values. And the key that we're sending in here is going to be auth. And now if we go to run this and go back and I reload this, I open this up, and I open up the network tab, and I reload this, and I go to click on login, I'll see that there's a command that ends up getting passed here because it's a cross origin. It gets passed with a request method of options. It ends up getting back a response here with headers that specify what it will end up accepting. So it ends up accepting gets, put, patches, posts, some other ones from any origin. And then it actually makes the request. I'm sending it with a username and password. And it actually is going in and getting a token back here. Now when I call me, on the request headers, I've got again, I make another request to see if I'm able to make this request with the options. And then when I make it, I pass this auth token back, and I end up getting back the user. Now, that's fine. The only issue with it is that if I went to deploy this, it's going to attempt to make this AJAX call to localhost 3003. But frankly, that'll work in my environment because I'm running this. Okay? I could go and deploy this, and this will end up working in my own environment. And frankly, if you happen to have the API running on your machine, in that environment, it will end up working for you as well. Now, instead of doing this, what I want to do is do something like this. I'm going to use a templating engine that we haven't used before. It's pretty simplistic to use. It's called the EJS templating engine. And it looks, when you want to output something from this, you end up using %, equal sign. And instead of putting this in here, I'm going to go and get this from a parameter that's going to be used for my templating engine. So the same way that you use nunchucks, the same way that you end up using Swig, some people ended up using Pug. We're going to end up needing a templating engine because we want this to be a variable based upon our environment variable. So how do we get there? Well, just to make our lives a little bit easier, let me save this. And I'm going to create a views folder because all the templating engines look for things in the views folder. And I'm going to move this guy here, this index.html, and I'm going to move it into views. And now let's go over to our server. And what we'll do over here, instead of doing send file, let's say response.render. and we'll say we want to render index. Now, once we end up doing that, and I go back over here, it's going to tell me you have a problem because you don't have any default engine that's specified. Let me do an install. npm install EJS save. And npm run start dev again. Let's go over here and let's do a const EJS equals require EJS. And so this you've hopefully gotten used to. I'm going to say to my app, I want to set the view engine. I want it to look for HTML extensions by default. It's going to end up looking for it in this folder. And let me also just say app.engine and say, hey, look, when you end up using this HTML view engine, the way that you're going to end up getting your files is going to be EJS render file, almost exactly the same thing as Swig, or whichever other ones you ended up using. Let's make sure that I have that right. Base URL is not defined. Let's go over here and let's set up our base URL. And we'll say HTTP, we'll hard code it for the moment, localhost 3001. So now, and I think here I'm missing a slash. So let's put that in here and see if that works again. Let's see where it's going to here. Oh no, it's not 3001, it's 3003. So, and I think maybe I don't need this slash. Let's see. Okay, so the reason why I didn't need this slash is because it turns out that on my index.html page, I'm taking this base URL, and when I call this, at least here, and I attempt my login, I'm actually putting the slash in here so I don't need it on my base URL. So this is fine, this will end up working, but it still doesn't solve the problem of what happens in other environments. So let's go over here and modify this just a little bit. And what we'll do over here is we'll say to our base URL, we'll say process environment base URL, or we'll do localhost 3003. When we're running locally, we don't have that environment variable set. So if I go to log in, this will still work the same way. Now what I can do here, I can go over here, git.status. I've got my node modules folder, so let me touch my git ignore, vi git ignore, and let me put in node modules, git.status, git.add, dot, git.commit, my commit, and let me go over here and I'll say Heroku create Acme web. And then let me specify git.push Heroku master. So now I've got, let's pretend that this is my production environment. I'm going to do Heroku open. And let's see what happens when I attempt to log in. So here, I'm running into a problem. Sure. So here, I'm running into a problem. One of the issues probably that I'm running into, I think, even though this is actually running locally, my guess is also that I'm doing an HTTPS, and I'm sure that the browser is not crazy about the idea of doing a HTTP request if this page is HTTPS. So one thing I could do is I could go to Heroku. And again, I've got my Heroku app deployed here, which is going to be this URL. And if I went over here, I could end up opening this up. And let's open up our Acme Web. Let's go over to our settings. We'll reveal our config variables. Let's set this. I could actually do this from the command line as well, but let's do it here. So we'll say base URL, and I'm going to go in here and I'm going to take this URL here minus the slash that I don't need. Put this in here.
So now you're going, instead of to something local, you're going to Heroku to another Heroku site.
That's correct. And it doesn't,
It works.
correct. It doesn't have to be another Heroku site. It could be any site. Right. And again, I have to say, I actually thought this would work because I am running localhost at the moment, but I'm guessing that there's some restriction about doing going from SSL to non-SSL. I could be wrong about this. We'll find out here in a second. So assuming that this starts to rebuild, so here, in fact, I could see, it took a second to run, but if I go to log in, it's actually logging in and it's going to hit this other URL. If I go to look at my source code here, I can see that my base URL here in my production environment is going to be my production API, and in my local environment here, if I'm running this, so this is npm run start dev. So in my local environment, if I view the source here, this is just hitting my local host for its API.
So could that go to the Heroku's server environment?
It could.
So if you put Heroku right there, it'll work.
Let's test it out. So this would be the example of mixing and matching, right?
So now you're going from the user interface side is not HTTPS.
You could always go in that direction. You could always get more secure. You can't get less secure.
Yeah, that's what I was.
So let's actually, that's a good point. Let's test this out. So now when we do our start dev, let's just, so we have this here. Let's say, I'm going to say start dev prod. Doesn't make any sense, but let's do it anyway. So here when we do our server, let's go in and set this environment variable, base URL, and let's go over here and get this API. Let's save this, and let's go over here. I'm going to kill this. Should be port. npm run start dev prod. And for my environment variables, I think I'm putting this in the wrong spot maybe. My environment variables need to be first. Try this one more time. So now this is running, and if I go to run this locally, which is going to be, if I can find it, localhost 3000 over here. And I go over here and I look at my XHR requests. Here I'm actually calling the production API. It would work.
And how that worked was you did this little base URL thing, you used this little template to pass it into the index.html. It did its thing and allowed you to make that call.
Right. So basically, the idea is that if you're going to have things that are going to be configurable, that are coming down to the client, and it's the client that's making the call, and it's something that's going to be configurable, you really have to have some template engine to do that, because what you're outputting to the client is going to be different based upon what the environment is. Anyway, I wanted to give you sort of a little bit more of a look in terms of how these APIs get used and get configured. I'll have time for one more question, and then we have to get to the React app.
Very fast. So all this was about was authenticating that client React application. You didn't really pull any data. Oh, you should have pulled the user data.
Mhm.
So you were really interacting with it.
Yeah,
Okay, thanks.
you're welcome. All right, so let me stop this, and we will get started with our Reacto.